Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
On the biggest day of my life, under lights that made everything look a little cleaner than reality, and in front of cameras that flatten your face but sharpen your choices, I walked onto that stage and saw an entire row of chairs with our last name taped to the backs like a promise, sitting untouched and polite, and I felt the kind of hollow that hums. The kind that makes you hear your own blood and your own breath while other people clap because they think clapping will carry you across the gap. Your family left, so I looked once, twice, a third time because denial loves threes, and when I found nothing but air and programs and one abandoned bottle of water sweating onto the carpet, I did what I have trained myself to do since high school band concerts and science fairs, and every other little finish line that never pulled my parents' car into the lot. I smiled for the broadcast, took the award from a stranger with a firm handshake, and leaned toward the microphone with that strange calm that comes when the fight is over and only the verdict remains, and I said, slow enough for the back row and cruel enough for the front, to those who skipped this moment, don't reach out now, and the sound of my own voice felt like breaking a locked window from the inside. I did not mean to be dramatic, though I know it looked like that. I meant to be accurate, because accuracy is all I have ever wanted from them, not confetti, not balloons, not some glow-in-the-dark poster that says proud of you in curvy letters. Just the truth that says we see you. We chose to be here. We didn't let errands and brunch or some vague headache outrank the day you finally crossed the river you kept drowning in, and I suppose there is a kind of dark comedy in the fact that the first time I got their attention, it was by talking to a lens instead of their faces, but maybe that fits our style, since our family always preferred polished Christmas cards to messy apologies, preferred public applause to private effort, preferred my brother's shiny chaos to my quiet grind, so of course the only time the story centers me is when it also embarrasses them, and yes, I can hear you judging me, and you are allowed, because I judged me too while the applause staggered and recovered, and the MC, an earnest man who deserved better than my plot twist, cleared his throat and said something about perseverance while avoiding the empty row like it might cough. The rest of the ceremony moved the way time does when you have already stepped out of it, every speech a watercolor, every joke a stone skipping just once before it sinks, and I kept my face in that safe place between pleased and composed while my phone, shoved deep in my clutch like a misbehaving pet, started to vibrate so often it felt like a second pulse, and I knew without looking that it would be the family group thread finally waking up from its nap, the thread where my name usually appears as a tag when someone wants me to fix a printer issue or pick up a prescription because I drive past there anyway, and I promised myself I would not read a single line until I could sit somewhere private. Because I have learned that some messages need walls around them, and some choices deserve silence to echo inside before you answer. When the lights cooled and the photographer did the rounds and a woman I barely know told me that my speech took guts, with the kind of grin that also means thank you for the entertainment, I slipped out a side door that the staff propped open with a folded chair. And outside the air smelled like wet concrete and cut flowers, the kind they cram into centerpieces for receptions that pretend gratitude is a theme, and I let my shoulders drop, finally, because no one was watching except a security guard who looked 17 and bored, and I pulled out my phone, which was lit up with missed calls from Mom, from Dad, from my brother, and from two numbers I didn't recognize that I would later learn belonged to my mother's friends who believe emergencies are best managed by committee, and the group thread was a parade of excuses marching two by two, a flat tire that was fixed too late, a neighbor who needed help, a misread start time, a stomach thing that came on suddenly, and my brother's contribution, which was not an excuse, but a joke about me loving the spotlight, a joke he punctuated with a little party hat icon because nothing says family like sarcasm with decorations. I typed and deleted 3 times because restraint is muscle memory in our house, then I decided against answering the chorus, not because I was noble but because I wanted to be exact. And I clicked into my camera roll where the event's livestream had already posted a neat, clipped version of my moment at the mic, and I downloaded the piece that held my line like a blade wrapped in velvet. And I wrote a caption that tasted like something I would not be able to unsay. I saved you a row, you. Saved your Saturday, and I posted it to the only place my mother monitors more obsessively than her own reflection, and I tag no one, because the right people know when they are the subject. And within minutes the hearts and messages from strangers began to layer like lacquer over something cracked, and for once the support did not feel like pity charity. It felt like a crowd saying we were there when they were not, which is both generous and embarrassing. Yet I took it because I have learned to accept leftovers when the main course is withheld. That was my first revenge of the night, petty and perfect, not a scream, not a door slam, not a dramatic purge of contacts or a ceremonial burning of family photos, just the decision to let their absence live in daylight where the paint peels differently. And while the video climbed into the algorithm like ivy on brick, the calls multiplied, and Mom's name bubbled up the screen again and again like a stubborn stain, and I did not pick up, not because I wanted to torture her, although a small, tired part of me did, but because I knew if I heard her voice too soon, I might offer her the lifeline she only throws me when an audience is watching, and I am done being the well they draw from when their own water tastes off. So I slid the phone face down on the passenger seat. I turned the key, and as the engine coughed to life, a new text appeared from my brother, just a single sentence that made my stomach drop even while my mouth lifted into something that looked like a dare. You have no idea what you just started. I drove with that single sentence from my brother ricocheting around the car like a loose screw in the door, making a small, irritating music that only I could hear. And while the city slid past in long ribbons of brake lights and storefront reflections, I let the memory reel spool itself, not the glamorous montage where a determined girl overcomes the odds in tidy chapters, but the less photogenic version where the camera sits too long on the family kitchen and catches how priorities harden into habits, because in our house affection arrived as performance bonuses for the loudest achievements, which meant my brother collected parades for things like scoring a routine goal or merely promising to keep his grades up, while I stacked quiet wins in the corner like folded towels no one noticed until they needed a clean one, and even now I can name the moments like street exits I missed because no one put a hand out. The regional science fair where the judge shook my hand and my parents texted that traffic was impossible, the orchestra recital where the seat beside me stayed empty while I watched other kids beam into their mothers' phones, the college decision day where Dad suggested a practical major and sent a link to a certification course as a consolation prize, and I took it because I have always been fluent in compromise, which is just another word for doing the emotional labor of 3 people while smiling like a flight attendant. When I finally got to my apartment, where the plants leaned toward the window like hopeful commuters and the mail still arrives with my last name spelled wrong, I tossed my keys and opened my laptop, not to rage and not to write a manifesto, but to catalog. Because cataloging is how I keep myself from pretending things were fine, and there it was on the timeline with a dozen of his friends chiming in like a bar crowd. My brother's post about my TV moment, the kind of smug paragraph that uses the word attention 3 times as if repetition were proof, and in the second line he managed to imply I had excluded them by choosing a weekday ceremony, which would be more persuasive if the date hadn't been on the family calendar since spring. And halfway down he stuck the landing with a little moral about humility that made me laugh out loud in a way that didn't feel healthy, because my brother giving lectures on humility is the culinary equivalent of a man who burns toast penning a cookbook on restraint, so I took a screenshot, not because I needed evidence, but because I needed the record that, when this went sideways, I had not imagined the tone. And in that small click I felt the tightness in my shoulders loosen just enough to consider the question he didn't know he asked. What, exactly, had I started? I made tea, the kind I drink when I want to avoid wine and decisions, and while the kettle made that thin, theatrical wine, I opened the family thread again and read the back scroll with a clinical patience I'm honestly a little proud of. Because usually I inhale their excuses like secondhand smoke, and one line stood out the way a typo does in a resume, a message from Mom timestamped 20 minutes before the ceremony, not addressed to me at all, but to a friend named Carol whose number I recognized from every holiday group photo, asking whether she thought the clip would air on the late news or only on the stream. which would be an innocent question if it hadn't been sent from a brunch table crowded with mimosas in the background of the very next photo she posted. So I put the phone down with a care I reserve for dishes I cannot afford to replace. And I said out loud into the quiet room that I was done pretending we were all trapped by unavoidable circumstances rather than choices. Dressed up as accidents, and then I sat with that for a minute, the way you sit with a word you think you understand until it tilts and shows you a new facet. Revenge arrived, not as a thunderclap but as a tidy, administrative idea that felt like a postcard stamped with my handwriting, because I did not want blood or fireworks, I wanted proportion, so I opened the video again and created a small, sharp edit where the camera lingers on the empty row placards before it cuts to my line at the microphone, and I paid a perfectly reasonable amount to boost the post to one zip code, the one where I learned to ride a bike and to swallow criticism without choking, with the audience filter set to people who follow our church, our neighborhood association, and the local news, because if we are going to live by appearances, let us at least be honest about the stage. And I wrote a caption that could pass for grace in poor lighting, saved a row, saved them a Saturday. Sometimes absence speaks fluent honesty, and I let the algorithm do what family never does, which is show up on time. I do not claim it was noble, but it was clean, and it did what I needed, which was to relocate the weight from my chest to their timeline without adding a single false note, and, while I watched the first handful of comments arrive, not all of them supportive. Because people love to advise women about tone even when the tone is simply accurate, I felt the phone vibrate again with a number I did not recognize, and a second later with a message request from a woman whose name I knew only from my brother's holiday boasts, an HR director at the company where he has used words like leadership and culture as if they were baseball cards to trade, and the preview line, hanging like a baited hook at the bottom of my locked screen, said, "We've met at charity nights, and I think we should talk about a post you were tagged in," which I had not been, and before I could decide whether this was the line I would cross in heels or sneakers, the number I did recognize, my mother's, lit the screen again. And her voicemail, when it landed with that small blunt thud, began with a sentence that made my fingers go cold while my jaw found a smile I did not trust. "Take it down before your brother loses something he can't get back." The voicemail sat there like a sealed envelope from a lawyer, heavy because of what it might prove about the family's strange economy of love and leverage, and while the kettle clicked off and the city's late traffic softened into a faraway hush, I pressed play, bracing for tears and contrition and whatever script mothers read when they want to tug the daughter back into the old choreography. But what came through was not remorse or even anger shaped like care, it was logistics spoken in a whisper that tried and failed to sound like advice. A chain of sentences about my brother's promotion review on Monday morning, about the executive panel that had been quietly watching his public presence because image equals trust and trust equals contracts, about the way a petty little internet drama could be misunderstood by people who do not know how we joke as a family, and about the fact that he could lose something he cannot get back, which I knew meant money and title and whatever badge men clip to their belt loops when they step into rooms and want respect to precede their handshake, and, while part of me, the dutiful archivist who always wants to file away harm and return to peace, considered the possibility of taking everything down and pretending this was a misunderstanding staged by a moody algorithm, a different part of me, the one that had sat alone at recitals and read my own name off program sheets like a stranger, finally raised her hand and asked why the only irreplaceable thing in this family was his future. I replayed the HR director's preview in my head and did not answer immediately, because good moves do not sprint, they stretch. And I opened a blank document and began to assemble a record that did not embellish or invent, but simply curated what the public had already seen. A neat packet of screenshots from my brother's feed where he coached younger colleagues to lean into the optics. A photo from a charity night where the branded car he was absolutely not supposed to drive after cocktails appears in the background like an uninvited witness, a thread of joking comments about a candidate he interviewed that, while meant as private bravado among friends, sounded like the kind of thing that rots culture from the inside when no one names it. and 2 calendar overlaps that suggested his side hustle used company software during office hours in a way their policy, which I found with 3 clicks on a careers page, forbade with the clarity of a stop sign, and I did not annotate these with my interpretations because I did not need to. I only added dates and times and the gentle reminder that everything was public at the time of capture, which is the difference between a trap and a mirror. I wrote the email in a voice I saved for difficult clients and complicated refunds, polite and cool and free of adjectives that would betray the beating in my throat. And I did not announce myself as a sister because that would have turned the thing into a feud rather than a report. I introduced myself as a woman whose work and safety depend on workplaces being what they say they are in recruiting videos. And I explained that a post mocking a woman for a televised boundary looked, to me, uncomfortably similar to the subtle ridicule that often precedes the big harms companies swear to prevent, and I attached the packet and clicked send with the same steady finger I have used to submit rent, because both actions secure a home of some kind. And the moment the little whoosh vanished, I sat back and waited for the guilt to crash over me, but instead there was a quiet, like the inside of a shell, and in that quiet I understood that there is a difference between vindictiveness, which wants spectacle, and accountability, which wants air. Because I know how narratives get rewritten by people who benefit from confusion, I also left a breadcrumb trail that neither boasts nor denies. A single line posted under my video where the comments had begun to polarize into free advice and armchair verdicts. A line that read, "I said what I said, and I will not be discussing family employment matters," which is the kind of sentence that makes busybodies hungry yet gives them nothing to chew, and I turned off replies, not as a dramatic flourish, but as an act of hygiene, and almost immediately the people who wanted me pliable slid into my direct messages with phrases like "be the bigger person," and "do you really want to ruin your brother," and "remember blood is thicker." And I deleted each message with the same energy I used to clear expired food from the fridge, because the lesson of adulthood is that keeping spoiled things around does not make you noble, only sick. The first call I chose to answer that night did not come from my mother or from my brother, whose name danced again and again on the glass like a moth that never learns. It came from my Aunt Denise, the relative who occupies that peculiar middle ground between ally and historian, the one who sends me birthday cards without money, but with sentences that sound like truths someone once told her in a kitchen while the cake cooled, and she began without preamble, saying she had just been at my parents' house where the television was tuned to the local news rerun, and the sound was turned up far too loud, and Mom was pacing with her phone in her palm, as if holding it harder would change the notifications. And Dad was rehearsing lines for tomorrow's men's group about grace and misunderstanding, and my brother, who had come over to strategize, was saying things I could just barely hear through the speaker about optics and the need to contain the narrative. And then Aunt Denise did the kindness nobody else in our family believes in by telling the truth with no garnish. They are more worried about how they look than how you feel, and if you fold now they will frame it as your apology. When we hung up, not because we ran out of things to say, but because I wanted the room to stop moving, I checked my inbox and found the HR director's reply waiting with the efficiency of someone who keeps their promises in both directions. A careful paragraph thanking me for the documentation, a clear statement that they take culture seriously, a request for a short phone conversation in the morning to verify the context, and a note that my name would remain confidential. And as I read it, my screen lit with a new text from my brother, a photo this time, taken in my parents' living room under the soft gold lamp that has seen every holiday argument we've ever staged. A photo of my award balanced on their mantelpiece beside the family portrait where I am cropped by the frame's matting, and the message said, in a tone that mistook possession for affection, "Bring the original home, and we can make this go away." And I felt the heat rise in a slow, almost luxurious wave as a different idea formed, one that did not shout or slash, one that stole back something he could not replace with a new badge or a louder toast, and I opened my banking app, found the monthly transfer that I have made for years without fanfare, the one that quietly covered an insurance gap no one ever acknowledged, and I hovered over the pause button long enough to hear my heart argue with my head before I pressed it. then scheduled an email to my parents with a sentence that contained no exclamation points and no apologies. Effective immediately, I will no longer fund what does not include me, and as the confirmation ping faded, I realized I had not yet listened to the second voicemail from my mother, the one timestamped 10 minutes after the first. And I tapped play, expecting another round of strategy, but what came through was a sound I had never heard from her before, a raw, open sob followed by a single, unsteady phrase that collapsed the distance between revenge and consequence. Your father just got a call from the church board. The phrase hung there in the dark kitchen with the tea gone cool and the steam long surrendered. Your father just got a call from the church board, and in that instant the night rearranged itself around a truth I had always suspected but never touched. That the performances we stage for communities we claim as families are stitched together with borrowed credit and misattributed generosity, and my father, whose favorite hobby is telling other men how to lead, had been relying on the quiet architecture of my labor to keep his image upright like a porch propped by an unacknowledged beam, because the board, according to my mother's broken message, wanted to discuss optics, a word I was beginning to hate for how it erases harm while flattering the mirror, and they also wanted to revisit a few donor recognitions, which I took to mean the plaques and bulletin shoutouts where his name had shown while my transfers cleared silently under the heading recurring support. I did not weep and I did not crow. I opened the folder on my desktop labeled receipts in a tone of humor only I understood, and there they were. The confirmations for the streaming upgrade bought during lockdown when the sanctuary needed cameras to reach living rooms, the youth transportation fund that kept the van insured for summer trips, the sponsorship for the community dinner where my father delivered a grace that landed like a sermon while everyone clapped for the Smith family's generosity, and on each line was my card and my address and my note to the office manager who thanked me for my modesty and asked whether I wanted my name listed or left anonymous. And I remembered declining not because I believed in secrecy as virtue, but because I believed, once upon a smaller version of myself, that credit in a family eventually circles home without you forcing it, and I realized, with a calm that felt like finding a misplaced key in the pocket you forgot to check, that tonight would be the last night I would be anyone's shadow donor. I drafted an email to the board chair whose address was printed every week beneath a clip-art dove, and I wrote in a voice smoother than my heartbeat that I wanted to correct a clerical inconsistency in recognition records. And I attached the receipts and the thread with the office manager, and I explained that for personal reasons I was ending a season of anonymous giving and that future acknowledgments should reflect the source without embellishment or substitution, and then, because I understand the currency of courtesy in places that confuse manners for morality, I added that I was grateful for the community's work and hoped transparent credit would strengthen trust. And I clicked send with the same quiet precision I used for the HR packet earlier, because the twin pillars of our family's power had always been the church kitchen and the office lunch, and tonight I had walked into both with the lights on. My phone, no longer face down but alive in my palm like a creature deciding whether to run, pulsed with new messages, my mother shifting registers from command to appeal. My father attempting a tone that landed somewhere between leaderly disappointment and a customer service script, phrases about damage and misunderstanding and the need to align. And I thought about alignment as a word people use when they want you to hurry back into the shape that makes them comfortable, and I remembered the youth group email list I had created for them during the streaming days, a list I still administrated because no one ever bothered to change the password I suggested. And an idea arose not from vengeance, but from the same instinct that corrects mislabeled jars in a pantry, the desire to place things where they belong and call them what they are. So I logged into the newsletter tool and drafted a simple note for next week's bulletin, scheduled not as a blast, but as a submission to the editor who would not ignore a clean PDF with header and footer already formatted. A short announcement that the donor wall would be updated to reflect accurate attributions, and that future youth scholarships would explicitly require family attendance at milestone events, when possible, not as punishment but as practice. Because showing up is the first generosity we teach at home. You might call that petty, and you would not be entirely wrong, yet there was something almost sanitary in the act, like bleaching the cutting board after too many onions have gone by, and if you think I didn't hesitate, you give me too little credit. Because I sat there with my finger hovering over schedule while memories unspooled, my father's proud hand on my brother's shoulder in the fellowship hall as he announced an internship, my mother's meticulous dessert table with labels written in that looping script that always reminded me of a performer's signature, the way people hugged me and said your family is such a blessing, as if blessings were something that simply happened rather than something maintained by invisible work. And then I pressed the key and felt not triumph but relief, a small exhale that made room in my ribs for something other than duty. Because I am not stupid and because I have learned that narrative control is the family's favorite sport, I also took a practical step that would look like cruelty to anyone who prefers women's contributions to remain backstage. I opened the streaming service account for the church, the one I set up during those tight months when the congregation learned to watch sermons in slippers, and I changed the billing from my card to the church's card on file with a note in the account that the donor had concluded her complimentary year of support. It was not a cut so much as a suture removed when the wound finally closes, and yet I knew, as surely as I know the pew creaks at the third hymn, that when the monthly charge appeared in their ledger under operations rather than under quiet miracle, someone would ask questions at the board table that landed like pebbles in my father's shoe. By the time I shut the laptop, the apartment had the stillness of a theater between acts, a hush dense with rearranged furniture and discarded script pages. And I stood at the window watching the glow of my own post climb through comments like a small fire learning the language of oxygen, and from the street below rose the tired laughter of people finishing a day they did not choose, but survived with humor. And I thought of my lease papers already signed and sitting on the counter beneath a magnet shaped like a lighthouse, another quiet decision I had made while waiting for an invitation that never came, and I realized I had built an exit long before I announced it, which is the only way women like me get to leave without burning ourselves too. The phone buzzed again with a new tone that cut through the family chorus. An email chime followed a second later by the dull, domestic cadence of a knock at my door, and when I glanced at the screen I saw two subject lines stacked like cards in a magician's hand. One from the HR director stamped urgent regarding next steps, and one from the church board chair marked acknowledgement and next Sunday's agenda, and before I could choose which doorway to enter first, the knocking came again, gentle but insistent, followed by my brother's voice pitched lower than usual in the hall, calling my name the way men call dogs they have not trained, and for a breath that felt longer than a season I considered staying still until the floorboards forgot I existed. Then I set the phone on the table without opening either message and reached for the deadbolt, because if we were going to finish this show, we might as well stop pretending the orchestra could drown out the truth. He stood in the hallway with the posture of a man who has rehearsed apologies only as negotiations, and with the eyes of a brother who learned early that charm is a universal coupon. And for a half-second the old choreography tugged at my muscles the way certain songs pull your feet toward the floor. Yet something steadier than anger held me upright as I let him in and watched him scan my small living room like a surveyor determining where to plant the flag, and before he could begin the familiar overture of minimization and conditional regret, I pointed to the chair by the window where the light makes even lies look honest and told him to sit, not as a power move, but as a boundary that finally had furniture. Then I opened my phone and placed it face up on the table with the voice memo app already armed, explaining in a tone that tried to be gentle but could not afford to be soft that if he intended to talk to me about optics while invoking love, the conversation would need accountability braided through it so neither of us could later claim we were speaking a different language. He began with a performance I knew by heart, a handful of phrases about family sticking together and misunderstandings spiraling in public, and my on-air sentence being brave, but not strategic. Which is what men say when a woman's clarity interferes with a reputation they monetize, and when he tried to lean on the slippery word we, I held up a hand and asked him to use names so I would know who did what and to whom, and to his credit he tried, stumbling over the admission that he had planned to skip the ceremony weeks ago because a client event promised better photos, that Mom had texted him during brunch when the broadcast clip hit the restaurant television. That Dad had crafted a line for Facebook he never posted because the comments under my video were not leaning their way, and that he had called the HR director not to apologize, but to frame my post as a sibling dust-up. Then realized she was already holding a folder I had curated with a steadiness he did not expect from the quiet one, and while he spoke the words like a man shoveling a path through wet snow, I watched the story rearrange itself into its actual shape, which is simply that everyone chose convenience and then prayed for a cleanup crew. I told him what I wanted, not in bullets because bullets can be dodged, but in a single long sentence that braided consequences with the chance to be better. That he would record a public apology addressed not to me but to the people who learned from our family how to rank daughters by noisiness. That he would say out loud that he mocked a boundary on the internet and that this was the opposite of leadership. That he would request the company publish a short internal memo on the difference between banter and contempt. That he would commit to showing up for the youth he likes to inspire with borrowed anecdotes by attending 2 milestones that do not involve his name on a program, and that our parents, whose love has always been part performance and part ledger, would correct the donor plaques and send a modest letter to the congregation acknowledging inaccurate credit and pledging, in simple language, to do better at showing up in private before asking for applause in public. And as I laid this out, he made that small scoffing sound men deploy when they mistake specificity for severity, yet I kept going, because the only revenge that leaves the air breathable is the kind that invites repair while refusing to subsidize the refusal. He asked what I would trade, because he understands the world as a marketplace, and I told him that if the apology existed in daylight and the corrections were submitted by the end of the week, I would email the HR director with a contextual note that, while the behavior concerned me, I recognized an attempt to learn and would not be pursuing any further documentation, and I would also message the board chair that my prior email had been sent to clarify attribution rather than to humiliate, which was true, and that I trusted the congregation to handle updates with dignity, which I did, and in offering this I did not promise outcomes that were not mine to deliver, only the piece of the story I could control, and I watched him calculate. Not because he is cruel, but because calculations are how he stays afloat, and then, perhaps because the house was quiet enough to hear his own pulse, or because the ladder he had been climbing suddenly felt brittle, he nodded once and said he would do it. Which is not the same as understanding, but is sometimes the only bridge available before the river rises. I handed him my phone and asked him to speak now while the room still smelled like tea and not like strategy, and to my surprise he did. He recorded a careful, halting apology that stumbled in the right places and steadied where it mattered, naming what he did without the algebra of excuses, and when he finished he looked at me like a boy who has finally read the instructions after 3 broken toys, and I saved the file and scheduled it to post in the morning with a caption I kept plain and almost tender, then drafted the 2 measured notes to the HR director and the board chair that placed his attempt in the record without laundering it into heroism. And as I typed, the apartment filled with the kind of fatigue that feels like the ocean tilting under a dock, the relief of a thing said balanced by the knowledge that saying is not yet doing. And I thought about the lease on the counter and the donor wall and the streaming account and understood with a clarity that did not gloat that sometimes you take your name back from a wall, and sometimes you take your face back from a camera, and sometimes you simply open the door and let the person who wronged you try again while the mic stays on. He left with my award in his hands because he had asked to borrow it for a family photo that would circulate in the same circles that once applauded a generosity I financed, and though every part of my spine hated the symbolism, I let it go. Not because I trusted him, but because leverage is not only possession, it is proof, and the proof would live on my page and in my inbox and on a bulletin board next Sunday, where names would be corrected even if voices trembled, and after the door closed I sat at the table with the 2 emails open and the posts scheduled and the phone vibrating itself into a small frenzy of notifications, some kind, some punitive. And I stared at the send buttons the way a diver looks at water she has already leapt into in dreams. Then I set the laptop to sleep and walked to the window where the city turned its late lights like bracelets in a distant hand. And I let the ringing continue because I could, because silence is not nothing, it is a choice that tastes like metal and mercy. And while the screen lit with my mother's name, and then with an unknown number, and then with the HR director's quiet confirmation, I exhaled the longest breath I have taken all year and whispered into the glass that I would decide in the morning whether to tap send or to let the scheduled posts speak for themselves, which is either bravery or cowardice, depending on who is telling the story. And perhaps that is the truest ending we get, a night full of messages, a promise half spoken, and a woman standing in her own light long enough to make everyone wonder which version she will choose when the clock turns and the broadcast begins again.